How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Renee in Indiana, Bella in Florida, Nancy, North Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Shandora in the Bronx, John in Maine, Belle in Texas, Bill in mid-Missouri, Lorraine in Texas, and Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Franco in Singapore. Welcome, Franco, from Singapore today. And Alan in New York City. And Yehuda in South Carolina. Welcome, everybody. Let's do another double daf as we aim to catch up. There will be some schedule changes this coming week. Tomorrow should be the regular time, like today. Tuesday, probably have an event, a family event in the evening. So probably going to do like a 3 p.m. Pacific teaching on Tuesday. But we'll announce that tomorrow during class, and then we'll post it on the Facebook page. Then we'll have class normal time on Wednesday. And then Thursday through Monday will be off because of another family event, a simcha, a wedding in the family. And we're going to be going to that, so we'll be taking a few days off. Okay, we are picking this up near the bottom of page 10b, and we'll be doing pages 11 and 12 here in Tractate Shevuos, the 26th volume of the Talmud, still discussing Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1. And I think actually there's only going to be the one Mishnah in this chapter before we complete the chapter, I think tomorrow. Okay, so we, very nuanced, right? We got into this with a Mishnah talking about oaths, swearing that something will happen or has happened, but because the Torah mentions 2 cases that imply another 2 cases, so 2 that are 4, the sages brought 3 other areas of the law that work the same way. The Torah lists 2 cases that, just prima facie imply 2 additional cases, so 2 that are 4. And one of those is that a person who, when the temple was standing, a person who was tameh had come into a contact with a source of ritual impurity, like a dead body or a dead creeping thing, was not permitted to enter the holy temple until he had gone through a purification process. And if he did it before being purified, that's a transgression. And if he did it unwittingly, then he becomes liable to bring a sin offering, a particular kind of sin offering, known as the sliding scale sin offering, sliding scale. So richer people brought a more expensive type of offering, poor people a less expensive type. But now the sages have been, and then the additional two cases, that's if you didn't realize you were tameh when you entered the temple or ate sacrificial foods. But it implies also that if you knew you were tameh, ritually impure, but you didn't realize you were standing in the temple or didn't realize food you were eating was a sacrificial food that could only be eaten while in a state of purity, that you would violate the same prohibition and become liable for the same offering if you did it unwittingly. Now, that's not written explicitly in the Torah, and now we've been looking into at a very, very close level similar laws and related laws about, so you bring a sin offering for the unwitting violation of a negative prohibition. But this sin offering now, when we're talking about atoning for an unwitting transgression of a prohibition involving sacred matters, offerings brought in the Holy Temple, walking into the Holy Temple while not in a state of purity. And then we are talking that the goats of Yom Kippur, one is sent out into the wilderness, the other was slaughtered in the Holy Temple, and then its blood was sprinkled inside the sanctuary, some of it even inside the Holy of Holies. And this would atone for a person who was not aware that they had violated that prohibition and therefore wouldn't know to bring that sliding scale sin offering. But the goats of Yom Kippur atone for him at least until he finds out. Now there's a bunch of nuances. When was his lapse of awareness? When did he find out? Did he know he was impure at the outset? And once we're talking about the goats of Yom Kippur, we also been talking about the goats that are brought on the new moon, meaning at the beginning of a Hebrew month, and the goats that are brought on festivals. Again, all this is while the temple is standing. It hasn't in 2,000 years, but we still study the laws just as intensely. And then the debate has been going on about, well, if these goats of the festivals and the new moons and Yom Kippur atone for the same transgressions, well, why are they separate goats brought on different days? Isn't that redundant? Do they really atone for the same thing? Or is it actually they atone for slightly different things? Maybe when you became aware, or when you didn't become aware, or could you become aware? Is it the sort of transgression that you could ever become aware of? So one view is, no, they atone for the same things. Or another view is they atone for different things, but they're interchangeable. Another view is, no, they atone for different things and they're not interchangeable. Okay, so this is the general drift of what we've been discussing. We picked this up about halfway down 10b, and we're going to go into a slightly, a related but slightly different area of atonement and sacrifices and whether they can be exchanged with each other or not. So, animals purchased for the purpose of sacrifices with funds collected for public offerings, right? When the Holy Temple was standing, there were offerings brought every day. Not just on holidays, not just on New Moon, not just on Yom Kippur, every day. Some of these were offerings that were brought by people who had either a peace offering or an elevation offering, gratitude to God, praising God, sometimes sin offerings because they had transgressed the type of law that requires a sin offering when you transgress it unwittingly. And there were the daily offerings that were brought on behalf of the whole nation. So the ones that were brought on behalf of the nation were purchased with public funds, communal funds, right? So animals purchased with funds that were collected for public offerings may be sacrificed only during the fiscal year in which those funds were given. And for this purpose, the fiscal year begins on the 1st of Nisan, the Hebrew month of Nisan, which is a spring month that contains Passover. Generally, once an animal has been consecrated as an offering, then even if for some reason it may no longer be sacrificed, it still cannot be redeemed unless it develops a blemish, which would render it impossible to offer it as a sacrifice, because blemished animals may not be brought on the altar, may not be brought as offerings, right? So if you have an animal that is unblemished, so it's still qualified to be given as an offering, but there's some other reason why it can't be sacrificed. Maybe it was a sin offering and the owner died before he could bring the offering. Or this, right? An offering that was purchased by the administration, so to speak, right? By the priests in the Holy Temple on behalf of the nation to bring as a public offering for the sins of the nation, or just to bring, for the well-being of the nation. But it had to be, but there was a yearly collection, right? The half shekel that everybody would donate every year, and plus donations that were made to the Holy Temple. And those funds, they would purchase, these goats or sheep or lambs that had to be sacrificed, but they had to be brought during that calendar or that fiscal calendar year in which those funds were collected. And so if they brought animals, and then for some reason not enough of them got sacrificed, there were leftover animals, so then the New Year's shekels would come in, and those shekels would have to be used to purchase communal offerings, and the old ones couldn't be used anymore, right? So they're not blemished, but they can't be brought on the altar. So what do you do with them, and why are we learning this now? What do we learn out from it? Okay. So generally, once an animal has been consecrated as an offering, then even if for some reason it may no longer be sacrificed, it still cannot be redeemed unless it develops a blemish. Rabbi Yochanan teaches an exception to this law. Rabbi Yochanan says, lambs consecrated for the daily offerings that were not needed by the public during the fiscal year in which they were purchased are redeemed, even if they are unblemished, and they may then be used for non-sacred purposes. Right, so even though this animal was consecrated, right, that it could only be used as an offering. So normally once an animal is consecrated, right, it can't ever go back into the flock and just join the other animals. Right, sometimes an animal is consecrated. Somebody says, I'm going to bring this animal as an offering. God has been really good to me. I had a great year in my business. I want to show my thanks to God. I'm going to dedicate this sheep. I'm going to bring it up to Jerusalem and dedicate as an offering. So that sheep is now consecrated. If he changes his mind, he can't just let that sheep rejoin the flock. There's all kinds of rules about that, particularly if it remains qualified to go up in the altar. It's unblemished. If it's blemished, then you can redeem it. But if it's unblemished, it's a whole set of laws about that. But now with these sheep that were purchased as communal offerings, there were like too many of them, so they weren't brought up during their fiscal year. Rabbi Yochanan is saying you can redeem it, even if it's unblemished. And when you redeem it, it just rejoins the herd. How is this possible? Rabbah was sitting and reciting this law in Rabbi Yochanan's name. And Rav Chisda said to him, huh? Who will listen to you and Rabbi Yochanan, your teacher, with regard to this law? And Rav Chisda clarified why he was so stunned. He says, but the sanctity that was inherent in them, in these animals that had been consecrated, to where has it gone? Since these animals were consecrated to become offerings, they should have been endowed with inherent sanctity. Only sanctity that inheres in an item's value, i.e., an item that was consecrated to the temple treasury, can be de-sacralized through redemption and just rejoin the herd. But an item with inherent sanctity cannot be de-sacralized. If it can't be offered, you just say, put it out to pasture. But you're not going to be able to just let it rejoin your herd and sell it or work it or do something else with it. Rabbah said to him, don't you also hold that we do not say that the sanctity was inherent in them, to where has it gone, poses a difficulty? But didn't we learn in a Mishna, in any fiscal year, one may use only incense that was purchased with funds collected for that year, right? There was incense always burning in the Holy Temple. And it was very expensive. This incense that was compounded by a very specialized family that had the recipe. And so, you would have to spend a lot of money to get the proper incense. It had to be the incense that needed to be burned that was purchased with the funds from that year. Same rule as these animals brought as communal offerings. And so what about it? Right? One may use only the incense that was purchased with funds collected for that year. So accordingly, the Mishnah asks, with regard to the surplus incense that remained unused at the end of the fiscal year, what would the temple treasurers do with it in order to render it usable for the following year? They would separate it from the temple treasury. They would separate from the temple treasury the wages for the artisans who worked for the temple, and those funds would thereby be de-sacralized, right? They would render them non-sacred because there was this leftover incense. And then they would de-sacralize the surplus incense by transferring its sanctity to that money that had been set aside for the artisans because it hadn't been used in the year before. Now we're going to use it in the new year. And then they would give the now de-sacralized incense to the artisans as their wages. And finally, they would repurchase it with the funds from the new collection carried out from the coming year. Right? So they went through a whole, complex financial scheme that was not in any way improper. It was just the moves that they had to make to square with desacralizing and consecrating so that the incense would be purchased with the funds of that fiscal year. But the point is, they were able to do that with the incense, so why can't they do that with the animals that were left over? So now Rabbah explains the proof from the Mishnah. One could ask, but why should the method described work? Let us say, according to your view, that the sanctity that was inherent in the incense, to where has it gone? It cannot be removed by redeeming it. Perforce, even you must concede that this question does not pose a difficulty, because in fact, we did that, right? We did desacralize the leftover incense and then resacralize it with new funds in the next year. Rav Chisda, who had raised the objection, said to him, did you say that there is a proof from the laws of incense? One cannot compare incense to animals consecrated for the daily offerings because incense is different, as it has only sanctity that inheres in its value, right? That much value, let's call it $10,000. $10,000 worth of incense has been consecrated for use this year. That amount of money, the value, but not that particular pile. Whereas when we're talking about animals, those particular animals had been set aside to be brought as offerings, not the cost of such animals. So according to Rav Chisda, you can't compare the laws of the value of incense to the actual animals that had been set aside. We're on page 11a. Now Rabbah comes back at Rav Chisda and says, if that is so, it should not become disqualified through contact with one who was ritually impure, who immersed that day, but is still not regarded as fully pure until nightfall. This is a person known as a tevel yom. That's a person who was ritually impure. Let's say, for example, he had come into contact with a dead body. He had a 7-day purification process. He was sprinkled with the water mixed with ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd and 7th day. Then he immersed in the mikvah. And his purification process will be complete at nightfall. So he's done everything else. He's done the sprinklings, the 7 days, immersed in the mikvah, and he's just waiting for nightfall. But his purification is not complete. If in that status, who's done everything else and immersed in the mikvah, but not yet, nightfall has not yet fallen, which is the signal that his purification is complete. If he comes into contact with something holy, does he impart tuma to it? Does he impart impurity to it? Specialized rules. This is a person known as a tevel yom, awaiting nightfall. Immersed and awaiting nightfall. It's called immersed that day. Tevel yom, he immersed that day, but it means he's awaiting nightfall. Okay, so the person who is a tevel yom, what does he disqualify? He's going to disqualify some kinds of consecrated items and not others. So Rabbah says to Rav Chisda, if that is so, it should not become disqualified through contact with the tevel yom. Why then is it taught in a baraisa with regard to the incense that once the priest has placed it in a mortar to grind it, it can be disqualified through contact with a tevel yom. Right? If you're saying that the incense, it has different rules than the animals of the communal offerings, because we have only consecrated its value, unlike the animals that we've actually consecrated the animals themselves. But coming into contact with the tevel yom, that is something that imparts impurity and therefore disqualifies something that is inherently sacred, not just that its value has been consecrated. And so here's a teaching, a baraisa, that says the tevel yom does disqualify the incense once it goes in the mortar. And Rabbah says, because he knows the arguments very well, that he's anticipating what Rav Chisda will say. He says, and if you would say, to defend your opinion, that all items that have sanctity that adheres in their value are also disqualified through contact with a tevel yom, but didn't we learn in a Mishna in Tractate Me'ilah with regard to the ingredients of meal offerings that one is liable for misusing them from when they are consecrated with sanctity that adheres in their value by the owner, verbally dedicating them to the temple. They haven't achieved inherent sanctity yet. They've just been set aside for their value. Once they are further consecrated with inherent sanctity by being placed in a service vessel, they become fit to be disqualified through contact with a tevel yom and through contact with one who has not yet brought an atonement offering to complete the purification process, and through being left overnight. Once it has inherent sanctity, it can be disqualified in these various means, including contact with a tevel yom. Sounds like, so we're trying to prove whether the incense is rendered something that can become disqualified through contact with a tevel yom because it has inherent sanctity, or, as he's now arguing, even as it's just consecrated for its value. And so now Rabbah completes the proof. So from this Mishnah, it is apparent that if the ingredients of meal offerings were consecrated with inherent sanctity by being placed in a service vessel, then yes, they can become disqualified through a tevel yom. But if they were not consecrated by being placed in the service vessel, then we only have them at the level of their value is consecrated, not inherent sanctity in the meal offerings themselves, and they will not be disqualified through contact with the one who immersed that day, as they have only sanctity that tevel yom, as they have only sanctity that adheres in their value, right? So he's making this distinction between the incense and the animals. How is Rav Chisda going to respond? So Rav Chisda says, let's look at your argument, Rabbah. What do you say? Do you say that the surplus incense, which was only placed in a mortar but never in a service vessel, has inherent sanctity? But if that is so, it should be disqualified by being left overnight, another particular rule of something once it has inherent sanctity. Why then did we learn in the Mishna and Me'ilah with regard to the handful of the meal offering that the priest takes to burn on the altar, which is a daily offering? The meal offering of priests, the meal offering that the priest takes to burn on the altar, and the frankincense, the incense, the meal offering of priests, the meal offering of an anointed priest, meaning the high priest, and the meal offering of libations, that one is liable for misusing them. From when? From when they are consecrated by verbally dedicating them for their purposes. So sounds like that's not just, consecrated for their value, but as soon as you set them aside, they can be disqualified like something that has inherent sanctity. Once they are further consecrated with actual inherent sanctity by being placed in a service vessel, they become fit to be disqualified through both contact with a tevel yom and through contact with one who has not yet brought an atonement offering and through being left overnight. So those are the two stages. So what is Rav Chisda trying to say? He explains it. Now from this Mishnah, it is apparent that if these items were consecrated with inherent sanctity, which happens when they're placed in the service vessel. Right, so think about it. If you're talking about incense, right, there's like the storehouse at the Holy Temple. All of it is sacred. It's all meant to be used in the Holy Temple. But it's really like its value is consecrated. And then it acquires inherent sanctity when a priest goes into the storeroom where the incense is and puts it in the service vessel that is going to be brought out to place it on the incense altar and burn it in the in the holy temple, right? At that point, its sacredness goes up a level, right? And likewise for meal offerings, which is a kind of flour that's going to be mixed with some oil and frankincense, etc. It could be in the stage of there's a certain amount of meal of this fine flour that's available. When you put it in a service vessel, its holiness level goes up, and it goes from consecration of its value to inherent sanctity in that flour itself. Right? So Rav Chisda is saying, from this Mishnah is apparent that if these items were consecrated with inherent sanctity by being placed in a service vessel, then yes, they can have been disqualified by being left overnight. But if they were not consecrated by being placed in a service vessel, then they will not be disqualified by being left overnight, as they have only sanctity attached to their value, not inherent. So apparently, even after the incense has been placed in the mortar, it still does not have inherent sanctity. The mortar is just part of its manufacturing. Service vessel is when we're ready to burn it. Rabbah said to him, did you say that you can provide a proof from the disqualification that occurs as a result of an item's being left overnight? Right, like a sin offering, parts of it are going to be eaten by the priests. They can eat it on the day that it's brought and that night, but anything that's left over the next morning can no longer be eaten. It needs to be burned. Right? So once it's left overnight into the next morning, that meat is now disqualified. It can no longer be eaten. Did you say that you can provide a proof from the disqualification that occurs as a result of an item being left overnight? One cannot do so because incense is different. Because even though it has inherent sanctity, it is not disqualified by being left overnight. That only applies to the meat of offerings. Incense, since its form remains unchanged throughout the entire year, this idea of being left overnight doesn't apply to it. And the disqualification brought about by being left overnight applies only to a substance that spoils over time. So the Gemara notes, in any case, Rav Chisda's initial question is still difficult. But the sanctity that was inherent in them, how can we redeem these sheep that were purchased by the Holy Temple to be used as offerings? They never developed blemishes. We just had too many of them. And they weren't brought during the year in which the funds from the community were used to purchase them. And now we can't bring them as offerings the following year because it's just a rule that they have to be, the only offerings brought on the altar on behalf of the community have to be purchased with funds that the community sent in that year. So, and then Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, so you can de-consecrate them, right? You can just purchase them back and they can go back into the flock. So their inherent sanctity, not just the sanctity of their value, but inherent sanctity, where did it go? That's what Rav Chisda was asking, right? So Rabbah said, with regard to the consecration of items for public offerings, such as daily offerings and incense, the reason we can de-sacralize them, even if they're not blemished, is because the court, right, the Sanhedrin, tacitly stipulates concerning them as follows. If they are ultimately required to be used as offerings in that year, then they are required for that, and they should be consecrated as offerings. But if they are not required that year, they are only to be consecrated for their value, i.e. for them to be sold and then for their proceeds to be used to purchase other offerings. The reason we can deconsecrate those animals is because they never acquired inherent sanctity. They were set aside to be used for offerings, but with the stipulation that if they weren't needed, they never were consecrated. They were only, at least inherently consecrated. They were only consecrated for their value. And that's why you don't just give them back, right? They have to be purchased back by some private owner, and that money goes into the temple treasury, and it can be used for the upkeep of the temple, etc. But the animals were never inherently consecrated. That's why they can be deconsecrated and returned to the flock. Abaye said to Rabbah, but wasn't it you, master, who said, if one consecrated a male ram for its value, since that ram is itself fit to be brought as an offering, it is automatically consecrated with inherent sanctity. It's not that it was only for its value. If you purchased a ram saying, I'm buying it to be brought as an offering on the altar, now it has inherent sanctity. You can't say it's just sanctity of its value. Since the items are fit to be used as offerings, they will automatically become consecrated with inherent sanctity, even if they are consecrated only for their value according to your intention. So Rabbah answers, this is not difficult. This case, where the ram is automatically consecrated with inherent sanctity, is referring to a situation where the donor says that it should be consecrated for the value of a burnt offering for which the ram is itself suitable. Whereas that case of the court's stipulation, that is analogous to a situation where the donor says that a ram should be consecrated for the value of libations, for which the ram itself is not suitable, and therefore it is not automatically consecrated in itself, but rather it's like the donor said, I'm giving this ram to be used for libations, meaning that you can sell the ram and the money you get for it, you could use to pay for libations, right? Wine offerings, wine that accompanies certain kinds of offerings is poured on the altar. You can pay for that wine. That's consecrating its value for an alternative purpose. And it's analogous to what the court said, right? We are stipulating that these lambs, it's their value that's being donated to be used for daily communal offerings. And then if they're actually going to be used, they can become that offering. But if not, right, if there's extra lambs, then they never were consecrated inherently. You can sell them and use the money for other needs of the temple. Abaye raised an objection to this suggestion from Rabbah, from that which is taught in a Baraisa, with regard to the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur. Right? So on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, has a lot to do. There's going to be the daily offerings that are brought every day, and there's going to be the additional offerings of Yom Kippur. That includes 2 goats and a bull. Right? What are the 2 goats? One is the scapegoat that goes out to the desert to Azazel, and the other is one we keep talking about that is slaughtered in the Holy Temple, and some of its blood is applied inside the Holy of Holies, and some is on the curtain of the Holy of Holies, and some of that blood, so that's the internal presentation of the goat's blood on Yom Kippur, and then some of that blood is mixed with the bull that is slaughtered on that day, and that blood is sprinkled on the altar. That's the external presentation of the blood on Yom Kippur. Okay? So with regard to the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur that were lost, right? So these animals were designated to be the bull or the goat or one of the goats of Yom Kippur. They were designated as such, and then they got away. Or they were stolen. Somehow they were lost. What do? And one separated and sacrificed another goat and another bull in their stead. Now on page 11b. And likewise, goats that were designated to atone for an act of unwitting public idolatry that were lost. Right? Meaning there was some kind of act of idolatry, unwitting idolatry, like the Sanhedrin or the king made some kind of a mistake, told people to do such and such activity that turned out to be idolatry. So the whole nation committed idolatry unwittingly. Torah specifies that if that happens, there's a particular offering that's brought for that. It's a goat. So what are we going to do if the goat that was set aside for that particular kind of sacrifice to make an atonement, what if that animal was lost, right? Same idea. So likewise, goats that were designated to atone for an act of unwitting public idolatry that were lost, and one separated and sacrificed other goats in their stead, right? The goat of Yom Kippur or the bull of Yom Kippur, the goat of public idolatry, to atone for public idolatry that they were set aside and then they were lost. So, okay, we designated a replacement animal and we brought that as a sacrifice on the altar. And then we find the original animal that was lost. So the sacrifice has already been taken care of. What do we do with the original animal? In such cases, all of the lost animals, should they be subsequently found, shall be left to die. This is in accordance with the law that a sin offering whose owner has already achieved atonement, that sin offering has to be left to die. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Minority view, we don't follow it. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say that replacement animal, the original animal that was found, that was lost and then found after its replacement had been brought in, it's said, what do we do with the original animal? They're taken out to pasture and they graze until they become unfit too old or blemished in some way. At a certain point, they're going to be old enough. They're going to be blemished in some way. And then they are sold and their proceeds are allocated for communal gift offerings. Their value goes to the temple. We can't use them. We can't take them back into the flock. We don't just leave them to die. We set them out to graze until they develop a blemish. Then we redeem them. They are not left to die because the law is that a communal sin offering is not left to die when it was lost and then replaced and then found. Now, Abaye explains how this is relevant to what we've been talking about. But why should it even be necessary to wait until these offerings develop a blemish? Let us say here also that the court tacitly stipulated concerning them so that if it ultimately emerges that they were not needed, then they should have only sanctity that inheres in their value, and therefore it should be possible to redeem them even if they do not develop a blemish, just like these animals, these leftover communal offerings beyond the fiscal year that we've been talking about just can be redeemed. Why not do the same with communal animals that were lost, replaced, and then found? Rabbah says, not so fast. Did you say that there is a proof from the case of lost animals? Cases of lost animals are different because they are not common. Therefore, the court does not stipulate concerning such an eventuality. We don't have a stipulation from the court that in case they don't get brought, then they were never consecrated inherently in the first place. We don't have such a stipulation because the court doesn't make stipulations like that for very unusual cases. So Abaye persists. Well, hold on a second. But consider the case of the red heifer, the all-red cow. There were 9 in Jewish history. Its ashes are needed for the waters of purification for somebody who came into contact with a dead body to be purified with it so that he can then regain his ritual purity and enter the temple if he would like. The case of the red heifer, which is not common, right? Only 9 of these cows in all of Jewish history, and yet it is taught in a baraisa, a red heifer may be redeemed for any disqualification that occurs to it. If it was set aside as a red heifer, it's consecrated. If it's disqualified in any way, it can be redeemed. Right? Remember that a red heifer, even if it is pure red, but if it turns out that it was used for work, it can no longer be used as the red heifer that is slaughtered and it's and consumed, and its ashes become the ashes for purification. It can be disqualified if it turns out that it worked. It can be disqualified if it turns out that it has 2 black hairs that are not red hairs. And there are other things too, right? So a red heifer may be redeemed for any disqualification that occurs to it. If it died, it shall be redeemed. If it was slaughtered in an improper place, it shall be redeemed. If another red heifer was found that is choicer than it, the first one shall be redeemed. But once the priest has slaughtered it properly and burned it on the arrangement of wood on the Mount of Olives, which is the procedure for creating the ashes of the red heifer, then it can no longer be redeemed. Now we have the ashes of the red heifer. So presumably, the reason it may be redeemed if a choicer red heifer was found is that the court tacitly stipulates that in such a case, it should be consecrated with sanctity that inheres only in its value, not inherently. It is apparent that even in the uncommon cases, like a red heifer, the court does make such stipulations. But Rabbah says, you're reading way too much into that case. You're misunderstanding. The red heifer is different. As in all its cases, it has only the sanctity of items consecrated for temple maintenance. A red heifer is not an offering. A red heifer is not slaughtered and then has its blood sprinkled on the altar. That's not what a red heifer is. It's very rare, it's very important, but it's not an offering. A red heifer goes through a very specialized ritual, and it is slaughtered and consumed on a bonfire, not in the holy temple, but rather on the Mount of Olives in view of the temple, but not on the temple mount. It is not an offering. And so you can't say that it has the holiness, the sanctity of an offering. In fact, its sanctity is understood at the level of an animal that was consecrated for the upkeep of the temple. It's like a donation to the temple. It's a donation on behalf of the Jewish people, but it's not the sanctity of an offering. A heifer is different, as in all cases, it has only the sanctity of items consecrated for temple maintenance, which adheres only in the item's value, and so it can always be redeemed, even if it is still unblemished. Abaye comes back at Rabbah. If so, if what you're saying is true, then if the red heifer died or was slaughtered, how can it be redeemed? In order for an item to be redeemed, don't we require that it first undergo the process of standing and valuation? If something is going to be redeemed, then a Kohen, a priest, has to assess its value to make sure that whoever is redeeming it isn't going to get too good a deal, right? Because if you buy something that belongs to the Holy Temple and you don't give enough money, right, then if you got too good a deal from the temple, then you would have misappropriated items of holiness. Right? You always want to overpay when you're buying something from the Holy Temple to ensure that you didn't accidentally misappropriate something holy for personal use, which is the prohibition known as me'ilah. And to ensure that that doesn't happen, anytime there is such a deal of redemption of a holy object by paying into the treasury, so then there's a Kohen, right, a priest who is, highly trained to make appraisals to make sure that this doesn't happen to the person who's buying it. But if the cow, the red heifer, had already died, how can we make such an appraisal? The animal must be stood before a priest who then evaluates how much it should be redeemed for. And that's an explicit law, Leviticus 27:11. And a dead animal cannot stand to be appraised. Rabbah answers, in accordance with whose opinion is this? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who says items consecrated to be offered on the altar were included in the requirement of standing and appraising. But items with the sanctity of items consecrated for temple maintenance, such as the red heifer, were not included in the requirement of specifically making an appraisal by standing and appraising. You can assess its value even after it's been slaughtered, just without the particular ritual of standing and appraising. Abaye asks, well, if, as you claim, the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, then say and try to justify its latter clause, which states, once the priest has slaughtered it properly on the arrangement of wood on the Mount of Olives, the red heifer, it can no longer be redeemed. And this statement is not consistent with Rabbi Shimon's opinion, as isn't it taught in the Baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says that the meat of a red heifer that was slaughtered properly is susceptible to becoming ritually impure with the ritual impurity of food, even though it is prohibited to partake of it in its current state, since it had a time when it was fit to be eaten. And in explanation of when it was fit to be eaten, Reish Lakish says that Rabbi Shimon would say that a red heifer may be redeemed even while it is upon its arrangement of wood. It is considered fit to be eaten due to the potential to redeem it, which would allow one to then eat it. So it is apparent from Reish Lakish's statement that the latter clause, and by logical extension the rest of the Baraisa, is not in accordance with Rabbi Shimon's opinion. So Rabbah answers Abaye and says, okay, I concede, therefore, that the red heifer can be redeemed due to the fact that the court makes a stipulation with regard to it. But nevertheless, I defend my opinion that they do not normally make a stipulation for uncommon cases. So rather, the case of a red heifer is different since it is of great monetary value, because, yeah, it's rare, but it's so rare and so valuable that, okay, we are going to have a court stipulation with regard to it. But in the normal case of uncommon cases, the court doesn't stipulate. And so that's why inherent sanctity might adhere where it wouldn't in the case where the court does make a stipulation like these communal sacrifices. The Gemara interjects this debate with a question concerning this Baraisa. The master said in the Baraisa, if a red heifer died, it shall be redeemed. And so, but may one redeem consecrated items in order to feed the meat from them to dogs? Certainly one may not, right? It was slaughtered not for eating, so we can't eat it. So what are we redeeming it for? Normally, meat that is not fit for eating that we would redeem, we would give it to dogs. But the meat of a red heifer that was consecrated and now it's been redeemed, we can't feed that to the dogs. It's still too holy for that. Certainly one may not do that. Nevertheless, the meat of a red heifer that died without being slaughtered is not suitable for any other purpose. So Rav Misharshia said it is redeemed for the sake of its hide. The Gemara asks, but does the court stand and stipulate with its mind on the hide of the heifer, which is presumably of little value? And Rav Kahana said, as people say in a popular adage, from a camel, even just its ear. Since a camel is so valuable, even the flesh of its ear is valuable and should be saved if possible. Similarly, the hide of a red heifer, yes, it's valuable enough to be contemplated by the court when it made such a stipulation. Abaye and Rabbah are still in the heat of it. Abaye objects to Rabbah's claim that the court tacitly stipulates concerning items consecrated for public offerings from the Mishna on page 2b. Right now, we understand why we're even talking about public offerings that didn't get used in the year that they were paid for with communal funds, that they can be redeemed or not. Now, Abaye is going to argue on that using our Mishnah here in tractate Shevuos. And now we understand why this whole argument is happening in the course of this chapter. The rabbis said to Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah, what is the law with regard to whether goats consecrated for different days may be sacrificed, this one in place of that one? For example, if a goat was initially consecrated to be sacrificed as part of Yom Kippur, may it be sacrificed instead as part of festival offerings? And Rabbi Shimon said to them, such a goat may be sacrificed. And they, the majority, said to Rabbi Shimon, since according to you their atonement is not the same, they atone for different things, at least unwitting violation of a person being tameh who went to the holy temple, but a difference of, did he know he was tameh at the beginning? Did he realize later? Slight differences like that they atone for slightly different things, the goats of Yom Kippur versus the goats of the festivals, right? So the rabbis say to Rabbi Shimon, well, you're saying that they atone for different types of cases. So how can you say that they're interchangeable with each other? Right? What is the law with regard to whether the goats consecrated for different, maybe... Right? They said to Rabbi Shimon, since according to you their atonement is not the same, how could they possibly be interchanged to be sacrificed? And Rabbi Shimon said to them, they can be interchanged since ultimately all of them come to atone for the same basic idea, the defiling of the temple, right? Entering the holy temple while you are tameh, ritually impure, or for eating sacrificial foods while you are impure. Abaye explains the objection brought from this Mishnah. But according to Rabbah, why did Rabbi Shimon give the reason that he gave? Let Rabbi Shimon say instead that the court tacitly stipulates concerning them that they should be consecrated for the day on which they are ultimately brought. And if they're not brought on that day, they could be used for something different, using the same device of the court stipulation. Now we see why we're talking about this. And Rabbah answers, did you say a proof from a statement of Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon does not accept the principle that the court tacitly stipulates concerning them, as is apparent from that which Rav Idi bar Avin says, that Rav Amram says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, concerning lambs consecrated for the daily offerings that were not needed by the public. According to the statement of Rabbi Shimon, they are not redeemed if they are unblemished. According to the statement of the rabbis, they are redeemed even if they are unblemished. And the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon and hold that the court does make stipulations, who are they? Where is their opinion recorded? If we say that they are the sages who ruled in the Mishnah cited above in Tractate Shekalim with regard to surplus incense that it may be redeemed, we can't bring a proof from there because incense is different. Incense is not an entity that can be left to graze. So the option that exists for animals to leave them to graze until they develop a blemish and then redeem them obviously cannot apply to the incense. Therefore, it is reasonable that with regard to incense, since there is no other way to rectify it, all concede that the court makes such a stipulation. Doesn't mean we're going to apply that to these goats of Yom Kippur versus goats of festivals. So rather say it is the opinion of the sages who ruled in the Baraisa cited above, and we're on page 12a now, with regard to the red heifer, that it may be redeemed if a choicer one is found. The Gemara, so we could learn out from the red heifer. But the Gemara rejects this. No. Perhaps the case of a red heifer is different, since it is of great monetary value, not like these daily offerings, which are expensive and nothing like a red heifer. Rather, say it is the opinion of the sages that it introduced with the phrase, they said to him, in our Mishna, here on page 2 of Tractate Shevuos. So the Gemara asks, from where do you know that the Tana referred to as the rabbis is Rabbi Yehuda, and that this is what he is saying to Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Yehuda is saying to Rabbi Shimon, granted, according to my opinion, that I say that the court tacitly stipulates concerning offerings that their consecration is contingent upon their eventual use, and if it is not used in that way, then we consider that was only sanctified for its value, not inherent in that particular animal, and it is due to this reason that they can be sacrificed on an occasion different from the one originally intended for. That's why we could use the goat of Yom Kippur that didn't actually get used on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Chodesh, or on Pesach. But according to your opinion, that you say that the court does not make such stipulations, why are they interchangeable? Why could we take an animal that has inherent sanctity for one purpose and use it on a different day, particularly if you say that they atone for slightly different things? But perhaps the Tana referred to as the rabbis, it's not the majority. Actually, here we're talking about is Rabbi Meir's opinion. And it's Rabbi Meir, not Rabbi Yehuda. And what is he saying to Rabbi Shimon? He's saying, granted, according to my opinion, Rabbi Meir's opinion, that I say that the atonement effected by the goats of the additional offerings of all three occasions, those of the new moons, the festivals, and Yom Kippur, is the same. On all three of those days, the goats that are brought atone for the same things. That's why they're interchangeable. So that's why they're interchangeable. We don't need a court stipulation. They're brought for the same purpose, is what Rabbi Meir would argue. And it is due to this reason that they can be sacrificed, that they can be interchanged and used on different days. But according to your opinion, Rabbi Shimon, that they don't affect atonement for the same thing. They affect slightly different cases of sin. Why could they be interchanged and used on different days? Since it cannot be demonstrated that the rabbi's opinion is based on the assumption that the court makes stipulations with regard to communal offerings, no proof can be drawn from the Mishnah. Rather, the opinion of the rabbis cited by Rabbi Yochanan is not necessarily recorded elsewhere, but Rabbi Yochanan learned it through a tradition that lambs consecrated for the daily offerings that were not needed by the public, according to the statement of Rabbi Shimon, cannot be redeemed if they are unblemished, while according to the statement of the rabbis, they may be redeemed even if they are unblemished. So the Gemara asks, okay, but according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who does not hold that the court tacitly stipulates concerning those lambs that were consecrated for daily offerings that remain unused at the end of the fiscal year, so what is done with them? And Rabbi Yitzchak says that Rabbi Yochanan says, one supplements the offerings brought on the altar with them. Whenever there were no obligatory offerings to be brought upon the altar, supplementary offerings would be offered upon it in order that it should not remain idle. Now, do you see the background underlying all of this? Who are these sages? Right? These are Amoraim, right? Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Chisda, Rabba, Abaye, right? They are all living and teaching and discussing, after the fall of the temple, right? Even well after, because the Mishnah was redacted around the year 200. The temple fell in around the year 70. They're all at least 130 years later, and so you'd think that they would just know. Well, what was the system that was in place, right? When the temple was standing, they had to deal with these laws and they had to have a system. So were they redeeming animals? Were they redeeming lambs that didn't get used at the end of a year? Why did the sages have to derive these laws, possibly hundreds of years later, about a historical phenomenon? It was going on. There was a holy temple in Jerusalem. They were bringing offerings. There were communal offerings every day. There were leftover lambs. So what was the policy? What was actually done? Seems like a lot of that knowledge was lost. Or perhaps, even if they knew what was done in practice, they would still go through this process asking, was it done correctly? Right? It wouldn't even matter what was actually done. It's possible that they got it wrong. And that's why they're going through, even though they should have been some kind of a tradition to tell them what really did happen in the temple. So let's continue. Now, Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says, and Rabbi Shimon concedes, with regard to goats of communal sin offerings that were lost, and for which replacements were offered in their stead, that even should they later be found, one does not supplement the offerings of the altar with those animals themselves. Rather, supplementary offerings are purchased with their value, i.e. the sin offerings should be left to graze until they develop a blemish, at which point they can be sold and proceeds used to purchase supplementary offerings, additional offerings, not the daily offerings. By Torah law, both communal burnt offerings and sin offerings that may no longer be offered for their intended purpose may be offered as supplementary burnt offerings. Nevertheless, Rabbi Shimon draws a distinction between the two cases. Here, where from the outset the animal is intended to be used as a burnt offering, i.e. for the daily offering, and now the intention is to use it as a supplementary burnt offering, the animal itself may be used, but because they're both burnt offerings. But there, where from the outset the animal is intended to be a sin offering, associated either with an individual bringing it as a sin offering, or even a communal sin offering, right? If the community had been led astray by a mistake of the leadership, but it's a sin offering, not a burnt offering, right? But there, where from the outset the animal is intended to be used as a sin offering, and now the intention is to use it as a burnt offering, there is a rabbinic decree rendering prohibited the use of the animal itself, even after its atonement has already been affected by a replacement sin offering, due to the concern that people will confuse it with a sin offering before its atonement had been affected by a replacement sin offering. Such a sin offering may be brought only for its original intended purpose of a sin offering. You can't use an animal that was designated to be a sin offering later as a burnt offering. Abaye said, we learned this in the Bryce as well. With regard to the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur that became lost, and one separated and sacrificed a different goat and bull in its stead, and likewise goats that were designated to atone for an act of unwitting public idolatry that were lost, and one separated and sacrificed others in their stead. In such cases, all the original animals, if they should subsequently be found, they should be left to die. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. But we follow the view of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, who say they are left to graze until they become unfit, and then they are sold and the proceeds are allocated to what? Communal gift offerings. They do not need to be left to die, because the law is that a communal sin offering is not left to die. And so Abaye explains how this baraisa supports Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak's claim. But why do Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say that the animals should be left to develop a blemish? Let these animals themselves be sacrificed as a supplementary burnt offering. Why are we taking them out to graze? Rather, what must one not conclude from the fact that they did not offer this suggestion that there is a rabbinic decree rendering prohibited the use of an animal itself, even after its atonement had already been affected by a replacement animal, due to the concern that people will confuse it with a sin offering that had not been replaced. And Rava said, we learned this law in a Mishna in Tractate Yoma 62a as well. If after the lottery for the two Yom Kippur goats, right, there's a lots, that's why it's called Yom Kippur, one goat out to the desert, one to be slaughtered on the Temple Mount. If after the lottery for the two Yom Kippur goats, one of them dies, do we just bring one more goat to replace that one? No, we bring two more goats. Right? We bring two more goats. Another pair is brought, and we perform a second lottery. So one becomes the counterpart of the remaining goat from the first pair, and the second, now superfluous goat is left to graze until it becomes unfit, and then it is sold and the proceeds are allocated to communal gift offerings. And this supports Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak's claim as follows. Why should the superfluous goat be left to develop a blemish? Let the animal itself be sacrificed as a supplementary burnt offering. Rather, we must conclude from the fact that the Mishna does not offer this suggestion that there is a rabbinic decree rendering prohibited the use of the animal itself even after its atonement has already been effected, due to the concern that people will confuse it with a sin offering before it was replaced. Ravina said, we learned this law in a Mishna, Tractate Tamura, as well. A guilt offering A guilt offering is similar to a sin offering, but brought for specific cases, including a case where you're not sure if you sinned or not. A guilt offering whose owner died or that was lost and before it was subsequently found, its owner achieved atonement through the replacement guilt offering. This animal should graze until it becomes unfit, and then it is sold and the proceeds are allocated for communal gift offerings. Rabbi Eliezer says it should be left to die. Rabbi Yehoshua says the owner of the guilt offering should bring a burnt offering with the proceeds of its sale. Ravina explains how this Mishna supports Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak's claim. But why should it be left to develop a blemish? Instead, let this animal itself be sacrificed as a supplementary burnt offering. Rather, we must conclude that there was a rabbinic decree that prohibited the use of the animal itself, even after its atonement has already been effected, due to the concern that people will confuse it and think that we could use sin offering animals that haven't been replaced as a different offering. We can only do that because it had been replaced, but less people make that mistake, we leave it to grace. And conclude from it that there is such a rabbinic decree. Rabbi Yochanan explained that Rabbi Shimon holds that lambs that were consecrated for the daily offerings that remain unused at the end of the fiscal year are offered as supplementary offerings. And the Gemara notes, and this is also taught in a Baraisa, what type of offerings would they bring from the surplus lambs that were consecrated for the daily offerings? They would bring from them dessert. Dessert like white figs for the altar. What's dessert for the altar? What they mean is sort of bonus offerings, right? They're gonna be offered on the altar. They're not satisfying the needs of the daily communal offerings, but we need to do something with them. So it's like the community is saying, hey, God, it turns out that we have a surplus. We love you so much. You've been so good to us. We're going to bring an additional offering. It's like dessert for the altar. And the Gemara asks, are white figs ever offered on the altar? But isn't it written, for any leavening or fruit honey, you shall not cause it to go up in smoke? And the Gemara answers, Rav Chanina teaches, supplementary offerings are to the altar like white figs for a person, right? A sweet additional dessert. Not necessary, but an act of love. The Gemara discusses what may be used for the supplementary offerings. Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda taught. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda taught one does not supplement the offerings of the altar with a bird burnt offering. Rav said the ruling is an absurdity. Of course you can't use birds. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said to Rava, what is the absurdity? This ruling has a basis. I said this ruling to Rav Nachman, and he said it in the name of Rav Shimi of Nehardea. As Rav Shimi of Nehardea says, the surplus lambs that were consecrated for the daily offerings are allocated for communal gift offerings, and there is not a bird burnt offering that is offered by the community. And also Shmuel holds, in accordance with this statement of Rabbi Yochanan, who taught that Rabbi Shimon holds that the lambs consecrated for the daily offering that were not used are brought as supplementary offerings, even though they were not originally consecrated for that purpose. As Rabbi Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, with regard to communal offerings, their consecration serves only to define which general category of offering they are included in, for example, whether they are a sin offering or a burnt offering, but it is the purpose for which they are ultimately slaughtered with a knife that defines what the precise nature of the offering is. And the Gemara notes this is also taught in a Baraisa with regard to sin offerings. And Rabbi Shimon concedes with regard to a goat consecrated to be used as part of the additional offerings on the pilgrimage festivals, that if it was not sacrificed on a pilgrimage festival, it can be sacrificed on the new moon, Rosh Chodesh. And if it was not sacrificed on Rosh Chodesh, it can be sacrificed on Yom Kippur. And if it was not sacrificed on Yom Kippur, it can be sacrificed on a pilgrimage festival, Pesach, Shevuos, or Sukkot. And if it was not sacrificed on the pilgrimage festival, it can be sacrificed on another pilgrimage festival. This is because from the outset, by virtue of its consecration, it came only to atone by having its blood presented upon the external altar, but its precise nature is defined only at the time that it is slaughtered. And another Baraisa teaches the same ruling. It is taught the sin offering was consecrated only to atone by having its blood presented on the external altar. And there we will knock off and continue tomorrow at the regular time. Just take one comment from Karen. Incense cannot be left to graze. And a laughing emoji. Exactly. Incense cannot be left to graze. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, see you tomorrow. We'll complete the chapter as we're working back toward actually discussing about oaths. But we have to do a little bit more work still to understand how the law of oaths connects to the law of offerings. All the best. Have a good night. See you, God willing, tomorrow, Monday, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And probable class time on Tuesday will be 3 p.m. Pacific. Special time on Tuesday, but we'll mention it again tomorrow.